To try today to present to you this philosophy of life the best way I can, using Western concepts, Western words. But as we'll see, one of the difficulties with presenting what we're going to be talking about today is it's not something that can be presented really. It's not something that I can transmit to you through words. It's not something that you can consciously or intentionally even follow. It's something that you kind of just have to live in order to understand it. And no amount of words, no amount of explanation, no amount of me sitting up here trying to talk about concepts to you is going to get you to understand it. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head as we go through this. Today we're going to be talking about Taoism. And I think this is a really cool philosophy of life, but again, it's going to be a little hard to wrap our minds around because it's the way of thinking that it's based on is not what we're used to in the West. So I assigned for you today chapter 3 of Alan Watts' book, Tao, the Watercourse Way. Has anybody heard of Alan Watts before or watched any or listened to any of Alan Watts' lectures on YouTube? There's a bunch of lectures on there. He's got a lot of really cool things to say. And basically, what he was doing while he was living is he was trying to translate Eastern philosophy into a language that Western audiences could understand. Because he saw a lot of wisdom and a lot of truth in these Eastern traditions, in these Eastern ways of thought. And he was trying to communicate that the best he could to Western audiences during the mid-20th century. We're going to talk about one of the philosophies of life that he lectured a lot on, which is Taoism. And the first thing that you need to know about Taoism is it didn't come out of a Western philosophical tradition. It's not a part of the Western history of philosophy. It's based in Eastern ancient Chinese philosophy. If you want to kind of understand what Taoism has to say and how it encourages us to live our lives, it would be helpful for you to understand the historical context in which its seminal text, the Tao Te Ching, was written. A lot of what we understand about Taoism is contained in this text called the Tao Te Ching, which was written a long time ago by this guy named Lao Tzu. Now, there are scholarly debates as to whether Lao Tzu was one person or whether this school of thought was developed by multiple people and then this book was just kind of like brought together. And so it didn't come from one source. But this is kind of who we say the author is. This book, the Tao Te Ching, was written during a particularly chaotic time in Chinese history. During this time, there was a bunch of political and social turmoil. There were all these different regions in China that were warring against one another for control of the land and control of resources. So it was written during this warring period in Chinese history, a very chaotic, turbulent time, and this historical context influenced the development of Taoism. Because as we'll see, Taoism is kind of all about learning to accept and work within the situation that's provided to you. And this would have been a very influential and practical philosophy in a time in which people's homes were constantly being raided, there was violence everywhere, and people couldn't count on their village to be very secure. So, the ancient Chinese people had to develop a philosophy or a way of life that would allow them to get through times as tough as having to deal with constant violence and chaos and insecurity. And what came out of this time was this philosophy of life, Taoism. In order to really understand what Taoism has to say and how it sees the world, and therefore what it says about how we should be living our lives, it's important for us to have a sort of grasp on some of the fundamental concepts in ancient Eastern philosophy. Have y'all ever seen this symbol before? What is that? Right. Yeah. One of these is colored black, right? This is a very deep and important concept in Eastern philosophy. It's supposed to represent what's called the polarity of the universe. And this concept deeply influences Taoist philosophy as well. What this concept or this idea is trying to get across is that the universe is composed of polar opposites. And in some sense, there is no darkness without light. There is no lightness without heaviness. There is no sound without silence. Rather, all that exists depends on this polarity in which everything that exists and everything that we can make sense of depends on this idea that one is never going to win out over another. One is not bad or good, even though we often apply these associations to the yin and yang. But that part of the fabric of the universe is this idea of polarity between two extremes, you might say. And the existence of things depends on this polarity, and it can be no other way. I'm going to read a part of this book in order to help get across what this concept of polarity, yin and yang, means in a little bit here. The basic idea is that all things in the universe exist in relation to and dependence on one another. Darkness would not exist without light. Sound would not exist without silence. Solid material would not exist without empty space. And more than this, we can't even make sense out of these concepts without what we perceive to be its opposite. All things exist in relation to and dependence on one another. And Watts talks about this in an earlier chapter in this book, on page 19. At the very roots of Chinese thinking and feeling, there lies the principle of polarity, which is not to be confused with the ideas of opposition or conflict. In the metaphors of other cultures, light is at war with darkness, life is at war with death, good with evil, and the positive with the negative. And thus, there is an idealism to cultivate the former and be rid of the latter. And this flourishes throughout much of the world. To the traditional Chinese way of thinking, though, this is as incomprehensible as an electric current without both positive and negative poles. For polarity is the principle that plus and minus, north and south, are different aspects of one and the same system, and that the disappearance of either one of them would be the disappearance of the system. The key to the relationship between yang and yin is called, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, sheng sheng, mutual arising or inseparability. I think it's like this. The key to the relationship between yang and yin is called sheng sheng, mutual arising or inseparability. As Lao Tzu puts it, when everyone knows beauty as beautiful, there is already ugliness. When everyone knows good as goodness, there is already evil. To be and not to be arise mutually. Difficult and easy are mutually realized. Long and short are mutually contrasted. High and low are mutually posited. Before and after are in mutual sequence. They are thus like the different but inseparable sides of the same coin, the poles of a magnet or pulse and interval in any vibration. There is never the ultimate possibility that either one will win over the other, for they are more like lovers wrestling than enemies fighting. It is thus of interest that a common Chinese expression for sexual intercourse is hua chen, the flowery combat, in which, of course, there is no wish in either partner to annihilate the other. But it is difficult in our logic to see that being and non-being are mutually generative and mutually supportive. For it is the great and imaginary terror of Western man that nothingness will be the permanent end of the universe. We do not easily grasp the point that the void is creative, and that being comes from non-being, as sound from silence and light from space. What is this? It's a marker. What is this marker made of? Plastic, deeper. What does physics say this marker is made of? Atoms. Is it completely full of atoms? No, it's not. Say more.
If there's space between every atom and everything, nothing's ever like actually touching.
Right. It's like this. This is what we call, this is an outline of the marker that we see in physical space. But really, it's a bunch of atoms in empty space. Being and non-being make up the marker. What is sound?
Waves. Yeah.
It's a wave, right? It's a vibration. What does a wave have? It has a crest and a trough, right? A higher part and a lower part. Where does sound come from? It's a weird question. Silence. No sound. No sound, right? It comes out of silence. Isn't that weird? Isn't it weird how there's this polarity between everything that exists? Goodness is only good because we have some sort of concept of what's bad. Pleasurable, we only know what that is like because we have some concept or experience of what's displeasurable. These things are inseparable, and being different, they're different aspects of one and the same singular system. And everything participates in both of these aspects. The aspects of being and non-being, high and low, good and bad, right and left, up and down. Another quote. 30 spokes unite at the wheel's hub. It is the center whole, literally from there not being, that makes it useful. Shape clay into a vessel. It is the space within that makes it useful. Cut out doors and windows for a room. It is the holes which make it useful. Therefore, profit comes from what is there, usefulness from what is not there. There's this idea then in ancient Eastern philosophy that this is how the universe works. The universe is composed at all times of two different aspects that are inseparable from one another. But ultimately, the universe is one singular system or process. The universe, in other words, if you want to put it in more new agey terms, is one. Taoism then is also informed by this idea that the universe is ultimately one. There are no real boundaries or distinctions between things, ultimately. We posit distinctions between things. We say this marker is different from this coffee mug. You are a different thing than I am. That clock is a different thing than the building over there. But all of these things that we think are separate from one another are all existing within the same system. All of this is occurring in the universe. All of this stuff is existing now, and all of these things only exist in relation to the other things that exist. It is as if the universe is one giant web or process or flow in which all of these nodes in the webs, these are just things that we kind of make up, but all of these things that are separate from one another, you can't pull it out of the web. If you pull it out of the web, the whole web becomes meaningless and is destroyed. Because everything that exists depends for its existence on what everything else is doing and how everything else is acting. And the meaning that we find in things and what things mean to us, what this means to you when you look at it, is dependent on what everything else means to you at the same time. This is a very different way of thinking. It's a very bizarre way of thinking. We're not used to this way of thinking because we have this Western scientific rationalistic mindset in which we posit there being firm boundaries and distinctions between every little thing. But really, at bottom, what the ancient Eastern philosophers are trying to say is everything is existing in the same process, in the same thing called the universe. Everything is, in a sense, dependent on everything else for its existence and for its meaning. These are some of the basic ideas on which Taoism is based. And I don't expect you to really understand this yet, but hopefully it will become a little more clear to you as we move forward. So having given you a background of some Eastern philosophy, let's now turn to what Taoism actually has to say. What did Emerson and what did Marcus Aurelius say about how we should live our lives, generally? What do you all remember? Let's start with Marcus Aurelius. What did he say? How should we live our lives? What's the right way to live? He talks a lot about cultivating inner strength, right? You got to be strong, you got to be virtuous, you got to be good. He talks a lot about how there are a lot of things that aren't under our control, right? But what we should do is those things that are under our control, we should master them, right? How we think and react to things and how we act in the world, that's under our control. So if we master that and we make our happiness dependent on what we can control, then our lives will be good, right? And Emerson said a similar thing, right? We need to become self-reliant because ultimately the only way we're going to find happiness or security in life is if we make the conditions of those things dependent on our internal state, which we can control, right? We can make ourselves stronger. We can forget what other people have to say because that's not going to bring us happiness and we can't control that, right? There's this element in these Western ways of thinking that although there are things that we can't control, if we get a really good mastery of the things we can control, we'll live a happy and successful life. One of Taoism's central tenets is that ultimately what we should do is give up control completely. Our lives are stressful and filled with anxiety and insecurity because we're trying to all the time grasp and control things. But if we resign ourselves to the way that things are, train ourselves to find happiness and contentment in what is, giving up control, that is where we'll find true peace and true happiness. Because there's no other way to do it, really. That's what we're going to get into right now. Taoism is based on this idea of the Tao. What is the Tao? Well, according to Watts, according to Chinese philosophy, the Tao is the course, the flow, the drift, or the process of nature. There is no stepping outside of it. We're having thoughts. We're having feelings. The atoms in the buildings are moving around. The clouds are moving overhead. The grass is growing. The water is flowing. There is this flow to the way the universe is operating. Stuff is happening inside and around and outside of all of us. And the Tao is that flow. You might think of it as like the flow of time. Like we're kind of sitting on this current and time is kind of just taking us right into the future. We're flowing with the operations of things. Stuff is happening. The Tao, capital D Tao, is supposed to be basically what happens. That's the Tao. We are all a part of what's happening. It does not mean the same thing as God. It's a little different than our Western concept of God. In the West, we have this idea of God as an agent who exists outside of time and space, a person who's kind of acting on the universe but exists outside of the universe. That's not what the Tao is. The Tao is not some agent existing outside of time and space, existing outside of nature, that's acting on things from above. Rather, the Tao is the totality of everything that is happening. It is the flow of things. It provides the ground of being and non-being. It provides for the possibility and conditions of everything and how everything is operating. It is more like, remember when we distinguished between two conceptions of God, agent versus arena? A God existing outside of time and space that acts on the universe is like an agent. Or we can think of God as like the arena in which everything in the universe is happening. The Tao is kind of like this, the arena concept, plus it is everything happening. It is not separate or separable from anything, anyone or anything. It is that thing, but it is also not that thing because it is the totality of everything and it is the condition for the things being the way that they are. It's a very difficult concept to grasp, and the reason why it's difficult to grasp is because it's not a concept at all. It is not something that can be categorized or understood or known because it is bigger than any of our categories. We can't fit it into any of our categories or our concepts or our language. Because even our language, even our concepts are part of the Tao. Even our thoughts are part of what is happening. Thus, it cannot be defined in words, even though I'm trying to define it for you. It cannot be defined in words or concepts, language or numbers or scientific theories. It is beyond categorization and understanding. It is not an idea or a concept. It is everything that is happening and how it's happening. Thus, you cannot define it in words, you cannot accurately describe it with concepts, you can't understand what the Tao is. Because your understanding is part of the Tao. And so whatever understanding you think you have of it will be not grasping it fully, if that makes sense. Watts talks about this on page 42, if you have the text in front of you. The Tao cannot be defined in words, and it is not an idea or a concept. As Chuang-Tzu says, it may be attained but not seen. Or in other words, felt but not conceived. Intuited but not categorized. Divined but not explained. In a similar way, air and water cannot be cut or clutched, and their flow ceases when they are enclosed. In a similar way, if we try to understand what the Tao is or explain it, it is like trying to put a stream in a bottle. It ceases to flow. It ceases to be what it is. And so what we are trying to understand or conceptualize or explain is not the Tao. We can't ever get there. Verbal description and definition may be compared to the nets which we visualize upon the earth and heavens to define and enclose the positions of mountains and lakes, planets and stars. But earth and heaven themselves are not cut by these imaginary strings. As Wittgenstein said, laws treat of the network and not of what the network describes, actual existence. For the game of Western philosophy and science is to trap the universe in the networks of words and numbers so that there is always the temptation to confuse the rules or laws of grammar and mathematics with the actual operations of nature. We must not, however, overlook the fact that human calculation and philosophy is also an operation of nature. But just as trees do not represent or symbolize rocks, our thoughts, even if intended to do so, do not necessarily represent trees and rocks. Thoughts grow in brains, as grass grows in fields. Any correspondence between our thoughts and the things out there in reality is abstract, as between 10 roses and 10 stones, which do not take into account the smell and color of the roses or the shapes and structures of the stones. Although thought is in nature, we must not confuse the game rules of thought with the patterns of nature, with what actually happens. Thus, according to Taoism, everything, every event, every process, every object is what it is only in relation to everything else. Markers are markers only in relation to everything that is not marker. Thoughts are thoughts only in relation to everything else. The heavens exist in relation to earth. Books exist in relation to everything else. Everything is this way. Thus, the meaning each thing or event has is a function of how everything relates to that thing and everything else at the same time. It's a very weird idea. All things or events or processes or objects are mutually arising. This is what is meant by mutually arising. They're existing at the same time in relation to everything else at the same time. And they are interdependent and interconnected. All things are interdependent and interconnected. If you want an example of this to help understand it a little better, check this out. All right, everybody watching? What just happened? What did I just do? Threw a marker. Okay, let's try to understand how that happened. What was the cause of the marker being thrown? My arm. Okay, what was the cause of my arm moving? My brain or my mind? Well, how does my brain or my mind work? What's the cause of my brain or mind making that specific thing happen? Neurotransmitters, biochemical reactions. What does that depend on?
DNA.
You might say, yeah, electricity maybe. Okay, but why was it at this time, at this particular point, that I threw the marker? To prove something to you. What was the cause of me throwing the marker, though? What happened before all the electrical firings that caused me to throw the marker? Well, my entire physical, biochemical past was leading up to this point and influenced that, right? And what does that depend on, and what does that affect? The way the universe, all the conditions of the universe were existing in a certain way to allow and influence that event. Right? There is nothing that is ultimately separate from anything else. If there was a different organization of particles in this room, if there was a different way the electricity fired in my brain, which was dependent on a whole bunch of stuff happening in a certain way, then this would have been a different event or thing, right? But whatever that was is dependent on everything else being the way that it was. If anything else was different, that would have been different, right?
So is this like a free will thing? Like, I don't know. It kind of sounds like it from you saying that.
Free will isn't even something that we're talking about.
I don't know, but if you're saying, like, because of your whole past, like, that's the reason you threw the marker, and if anything was different, then you wouldn't have done that, then it's like you had no control over whether or not you threw the marker.
We can talk about control. We can talk about this idea of, well, is what's happening in my body the cause of all this? Am I the cause of that stuff? The point is just that everything is connected in a certain ultimate fundamental way, even though we don't really want to recognize or think about it. We can turn this into a problem of free will, but that wasn't what I was trying to get at. What I was trying to get at was what everything is and what everything means is dependent on the way that everything else is and means. Otherwise, it would be something else. And everything that is and what everything means is all a part of this one interconnected, interdependent thing we call the universe. Thus, nothing is ultimately separate from anything else. If you're going to make sense of what just happened here, of why protons are the way that they are, why coffee makes us feel a certain way, if you wanted to tell a complete story or have a complete explanation for all that, you'd have to explain everything at the same time. This is kind of the idea that they're trying to get across, is that all things, events, processes, and objects are mutually arising. What they are and what they mean is part of a package with everything else. Everything is existing, in a sense, also in the eternal now, within the course, within the flow of the Tao. Related to this idea, and this is where we start getting into the more practical or perhaps more easily understood aspects of Taoism, is this idea that insofar as everything is connected and everything is just kind of doing its thing because of the way that it is, things can only do their thing if other things are doing their thing, naturally. The motions of the planets and the stars can only occur if the laws of physics are doing their thing and nothing interrupts that process. This computer can only do its thing if the electrons and protons are also doing their thing. I can only do my thing, whatever that is, as long as nothing is getting in the way and interrupting that. There's this idea then in Taoism that insofar as what everything is and means is dependent and interconnected with everything else, that everything can operate only according to its own nature, insofar as everything also is operating according to its own nature. And things cannot operate except according to their nature, what they are. In other words, things cannot be or act other than what they are. This marker does what it does because of what it is. It's a marker, right? It can do marker things. And it does marker things. This book does what it does and is what it is because of what it is. It's a book, right? It has certain characteristics, certain properties. It does book stuff. Wolves do wolf things. Humans do human things. Everything is operating according to its own nature. Nothing can operate except according to its own nature, right? Buildings don't operate like seahorses. Clothes don't operate like sheep. Coffee doesn't operate like a book. Everything is doing its own thing because of the way that it is, and the way that it is in a sense interdependent and interconnected on everything else. And thus there is this kind of optimistic view, this is where we start getting to the philosophy of life aspect, how we should live our lives, that if everything is just allowed to do what it does by its own nature, if everything is allowed to go its own way, the harmony of the universe will be established. Since every process and every event and everything can only do its own thing in relation to everything else doing its own thing. In other words, the Taoists are saying then that seen as a whole, the universe is a harmony or symbiosis of patterns which cannot exist without each other. However, when it is looked at section by section, we find conflict. The biological world is a mutual eating society, in which every species is the prey of another. But if there were any species not preyed upon, it would increase and multiply to its own self-strangulation, as human beings, through their skill in defeating other species, are in danger of disrupting the whole biological order by overpopulation, and thus of destroying themselves. For this reason, anyone who sets out to govern the world puts everything and especially himself, in danger. Those who would take over the world and manage it, I see that they cannot grasp it. For the world is a spiritual vessel and cannot be forced. Whoever forces it spoils it. Whoever grasps it loses it. Let's take a practical example. We have a forest. We have an ecosystem. There are wolves and deer. What happens if the wolves eat 90% of the deer? What's going to happen in that ecosystem?
The stuff that the deer eat is going to be overpopulated. Although I think they just eat plants, so I don't know if that works.
The wolves eat the deer. They're having a great season, so they're reproducing a lot. Right? Up goes the wolf population in 1 year. It's called 2000. Well, now in the next year, since they ate 90% of the deer, what's going to happen to the wolf population in this year? There's not going to be enough food for all the wolves, right? It's going to go back down. All right, now let's talk about the deer population. Because the wolf population went drastically down in this year, what's going to happen to the deer population? It's going to go back up. Oh, snap. Now there is a whole bunch of deer for the wolves to eat, right? And then the wolf population goes back up, and they kill the deer, right? The deer goes back down. Nature is a harmony of all these patterns existing that are self-correcting mechanisms. What happens in ecosystems is when humans introduce some species that don't belong there, or they try to control it by manually controlling the deer population or manually controlling the wolf population. The idea is that if everything is just allowed to do what it does, harmony will be established. There's no need to force and to meddle in things or interrupt the processes of nature. And it's the same thing with our own lives and what we ought to be doing if we want to live happy and secure lives and fulfilling lives. What happens in the West, because of the way that we see the world and the way that we organize society, is we think that we need to control and understand and explain everything. Right? The fact that we have a government is a testament to the idea that we feel like we need to control people's behavior, or else society is going to be chaotic and bad and everything is going to be destroyed. Right? But what the Taoists are trying to get us to realize is that we're all existing in this same system, this same universe in which there is a symbiosis, there's a harmony of the processes that are occurring. And our intentional action, forcing things, trying to control things, trying to grasp things, is what's fucking it all up, ultimately. And when we try to do that with our own lives, we see similar results. What happens when you feel like you aren't living up to the best person you can be? You get down on yourself, you get sad, you feel like I need to control my behavior, I need to force myself to wake up at this time, I need to force myself to go to the gym. Do you end up making any progress? Or do you just get down on yourself more and fail? What happens if you try to control everything in your life? If you try to control what other people think about you, if you try to control, how your boyfriend sees you, if you try to control everything related to, your lifestyle and what you eat and all this stuff. When you're in that mindset of trying to control and grasp everything, the world feels like a dangerous place. You mess things up, you get inside your own head, you get anxious and stressed. According to Taoism, what we need to do if we want to have a happy, fulfilled life is we need to realize that nothing was under our control to begin with. And we need to give up our fetish of control and our fetish of trying to understand everything. You can see how the historical context influenced this development of this philosophy, right? They were living during this warring period. They didn't have control over their own lives, really. They didn't have control of when they would be attacked, if their family members would be raped or killed. And so they developed a philosophy which found that the secret to happiness, and the secret actually to control, is giving up your control entirely. Once you've given up controlling everything, once you have accepted the way that things are and you don't try to force them to be the way that you want them to be, nothing bothers you anymore. Nothing has power over you because you're not trying to force the thing and you're not trying to expect the thing to be the way that you want it to be. Think about this in psychological terms. When you feel sad or when you feel angry or have a traumatic experience, what happens if you try to control it the way that you feel? If you're like, I don't want to feel sadness right now, I'm going to distract myself with Netflix, right? Or I'm going to smoke a bunch of weed, right? I want to run away from that. What does that end up doing in the long term?
It gets like bottled up.
It gets bottled up and it never goes away, right? What happens if you were to give up control of your thoughts and your feelings? You would actually just process them and you would move past them, right? And they would no longer have a stranglehold on your life, right? Same thing with perhaps how you're living your life now. If you try to control and grasp everything, if you're constantly berating yourself because you're not being the way that you think you should be, that just adds misery and anxiety and stress to your life, right? What if you just accepted the way that you were? What if you accepted what you thought and you felt and you didn't try to constantly control your feelings, you didn't try to constantly control your behavior or actions or the behavior and actions of other people? The Taoists would say, if you continue along this path, not only do you find happiness, not only do you find security, but you become, in a sense, indestructible. If you accept the way things are, if you just let everything do its thing, including what's going on inside you, and you don't constantly judge it, you don't constantly control it, you don't try to meddle in everything, you will attain a kind of security and fulfillment that is unimaginable. But this isn't something that can be consciously or intentionally done. Because if you're intentionally trying to give up control of things, you've missed the point entirely, right? The point is to let everything go its own way naturally, what it's naturally going to do. Which is why Taoism is a philosophy of life that you can't consciously or intentionally pursue. If you're trying to be a Taoist, you're not a Taoist. Why? Because you're trying to put yourself into this mold, right? You're trying to control your life in a certain way. This is why I said at the beginning, it's only a philosophy of life that can be lived. It can't be understood. You can't force yourself into doing it. As much as I, care about all of you and respect you and enjoy you being in this class, I don't give a shit about what you think of me. Look at what I'm wearing today. What do I normally wear? I dress up all nice, right? I wear a tie, maybe. I don't even have socks on right now, right? I don't like socks, okay? I never like socks. So what if I just let myself be my sockless self? I'm wearing like a pajama shirt, I don't wear this shirt out ever, really. How much freeing and happy would you be if you just let go of control? If you just learned to accept things. If you weren't so harsh on yourself. This is what Taoism is trying to get at. Understanding and practicing Taoism would require then a shift in our psychology, our action, and our experience. We have been taught and we have been conditioned to control and grasp and understand and explain everything because we think this is what's going to allow us to be happy. But the Taoists are saying that's the exact opposite of how you find peace in this life. Trying to grasp and force and control things just fucks things up because when you do that, you get in the way of things doing what they're going to do naturally. And there is a harmony that's established when things are just allowed to do what they're supposed to do naturally. The answer is not to cultivate control over everything or to cultivate control over the things you think you control, but to give up control entirely. Worry and stress and anxiety only results from you not having control over the things that you want or wish to have control over. Right? Thus, you've probably heard this phrase before. This is an excellent summary of Taoism. Being a Taoist, then, means going with the flow of things. It means not taking life too seriously. It means not worrying about what other people think of you, not worrying what's going on, right? That's not letting go of control. It means letting go. Your car breaks down. You don't worry and stress about it. You just roll with the punches. You do what occurs to you to do in the moment. You exist, and the only thing that is real, the eternal now, going with the flow of the Tao. Our misery and our unhappiness and our insecurity results from trying to control things and then failing. So we can escape the predicament entirely by accepting what is, understanding how the processes of nature work, and working within those processes. Being a Taoist in essence, means practicing Wu Wei, which means non-action. But it doesn't mean laziness. It doesn't mean mere passivity. It doesn't mean just letting stuff happen to you. It means working within the patterns and the flow of things. It means understanding how things work and then operating intelligently within that framework. How someone who practices judo will use the weight of the person coming at them to flip them over without picking them up and throwing them, right? There is an energy that's coming towards them and they work with that energy coming and they flip them over, right? Let's listen to Alan Watts just describe kind of this mindset a little bit. Hopefully this will help you grasp kind of what Taoism is trying to get at, what it means to be a Taoist. Because I realize it's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of being. It's not something we're used to. It sounds very scary. But I think there's a certain wisdom to it.
Anxious and hectic. It felt like fuel for my distraction. It's highly.
Zhuangzi, he often says, people who are trying to help things along are a nuisance. The do-gooders, he has a conversation between Lao Tzu and Confucius, in which Confucius is prating about charity and duty to one's neighbor. And Lao Tzu says to him, this is nonsense. He is just binding things onto people, putting burdens on them with charity and duty to one's neighbor. He says to Confucius, look now at the universe. The trees grow upwards without exception. The stars always follow their courses, and the migrating birds at the various seasons always cluster with complete regularity. But they don't say anything. They don't have any religion. And your idea of eliminating yourself is a positive manifestation of self. You have brought much confusion, sir, to the kingdom, because you are like one who beats a drum in search of a fugitive. So when you sound all sorts of drums and promise to be virtuous and make resolutions to be virtuous, you're in for trouble. The devil hears you coming. You see, now this is something that's very important. There is a Zen story which describes a woodcutter working in the forest, chopping down trees. And he suddenly noticed in a bush over there an animal that was watching. And this animal is a satori owl. And he thought, I'm going to get that animal for lunch. But the animal could read his thoughts. And the animal said to him, you think you're going to catch me, don't you? And the woodsman looked round and he made for it, and the animal vanished. And then appeared at the opposite end of the clearing, laughing, saying, you can't catch me. He thought, the next time I see that animal, I'm going to move to the opposite end of the clearing from which it appears, catch it that way. And the animal said, you're thinking, aren't you, to go to the opposite side of the clearing from which you see me? And for a while, the man tried by going in various directions with his axe to catch this animal, all to no avail. He got disgusted and went back to chopping the tree. And the animal laughed at him again and said, "So you've given up." Just that moment, the axe head flew off the axe and killed the animal. You see, he had to get it without intention to do so. That's what's called purposelessness in Taoism, which is a form of Wu Wei. And the Taoist text says, when purpose has been used to achieve purposelessness, the point has been grasped. So, it's the same problem we have in India. You know, there's a superstition that if you think of a monkey while you're taking medicine, the medicine won't work. You're in the predicament of trying not to think of the monkey while taking medicine. And that happens to us whenever we try to be natural. Everybody can see it's forced, it's fake. And so you think then, how can I be genuinely natural? How can I really flow with the course of nature? How can I let my mind think whatever it wants to think? Because the moment I start doing that, I realize I'm doing it with an ulterior motive. I'm trying to meditate, I'm trying to grow spiritually. And that ruins the whole thing. When you've tried for a long time to get the right attitude, and you find that all the attitudes you get are phony ones, then you come to the realization there's nothing you can do about it. It really doesn't make any difference. And again, the principle that I've emphasized all along, you give up. And in so doing, gain the strength and energy that you were looking for. You see, it's like trying to live in the present. Gurdjieff used to set his students the exercise he called self-remembering. That is, constantly, all day long, be completely aware of what you're doing. Have your mind always on the immediate moment. Till one fine day you realize, to your astonishment, there is no way at all of having your mind anywhere else but in the present moment. Because even when you think about the past or the future, you're doing it now, aren't you? And that results in a very curious transformation of consciousness. You feel that the present moment is flowing along and carrying you with it all the time. Just like the flow of the Tao. The flow of the Tao is as what we would call the flow of the present. See? And you're with it. There's no way of being anywhere else. The Jungyong, the book called The Unwobbling Pivot, says the Tao is that from which one cannot deviate. That from which one can deviate is not the Tao. Or to put it in the form of a Zen story, the master Joshu said to Nansen, "What is the Tao?" Nansen replied, "Your everyday mind is the Tao." Joshu asked, "How do you get into accord with it?" Nansen replied, "When you try to accord, you deviate." This sounds like a completely laissez-faire, spineless attitude to life, but it is precisely Taoism, which underlies, in common with Buddhism, in conjunction with Buddhism, it underlies the greatest achievements of Chinese art and culture. It underlies judo. It underlies the Zen arts of Japan, calligraphy, architecture, gardens. The form of Chinese philosophy which in subsequent years became most interested in science and in the study of nature. The Confucians never had any interest in science because they were bookish people. They were all absorbed in texts. They were essentially scholastics and never opened the book of nature. But the Taoists were always observing natural phenomena, how they worked. They were interested above all in manual skills. and using the Tao to perfect manual skills. And therefore, these lazy people achieved the most interesting results because they were like water, which is lazy and always seeks the line of least resistance. But that is almost the same thing as intelligence.
If you had a choice, would you rather pay $12 for this cheese grater on Amazon?
So be like a cat. How does a cat act? What does a cat do? Does a cat listen to you? Does a cat do what you want it to do? When a cat is tired, it will sleep. When it is hungry, it will eat. When it wants to go lay down and say, screw all that, that's what it does, right? What if everyone behaved like this? What if everyone just did what came to them naturally? I doubt we can imagine a world like that. We've set up in our minds and our ways of thinking and being so many artificial constructions. Try to force ourselves to do so many things. We may not even be in touch with much of what we would naturally do. But giving up control, according to the Taoists, living and acting with an intelligent sense of what's going on around you, with a focus on the present moment, that's the best way to live. Not worrying, trying to control everything, trying to get other people to behave the way that you want them to behave. So that's a lot, right? It's a lot to take in. Do y'all like this idea? You think maybe it's unattainable?
My brain always goes to like the worst case scenario. And like, I think that there's just be a mind drum. Because yes, everyone doing what they truly want to do is great. But what about rapists? What about child predators? What about murderers? You know, they're just going with the flow, doing what they want to do. I don't like that reality. I don't want to see children get molested and people get raped, and I think putting some control on that is not a bad thing, which I think most people agree with. But, you know, I think adopting this for your own personal life, not that you can really adopt it, you kind of just go into it.
Right.
It's nice, and I do really like this whole idea of going with the flow. But like I said, like, I don't know, my brain always goes like, okay, there's gotta be exceptions here, and that's where my brain's going, is like, there's really, really shitty people that are gonna do really, really shitty things, and everyone just does it without restriction from governments or anything.
Yeah. Well, how are rapists and murderers formed? Is it natural? Is it nurture?
Lack thereof.
Yeah. Usually, what ends up happening is there's some sort of traumatic experience in their lives, right? Not always, but that ends up playing a contributory role. What if they didn't bury that and they processed that experience? I wonder if we would have less murderers and rapists. And I wonder if we would have a better society if people weren't constantly worried or structuring their lives around these judgments and these morals and these expectations of others, right? So much of what we think and do is built on those things. How freeing would it be just to be rid of them all for forever? Sounds lovely, right?
You talked about like giving up control and like you need to stop trying to control things, which I totally agree with. But I have like in a recent past become a very controlling person, and like it honestly it came out of nowhere. Like I wasn't trying to. It's just like I kind of just looked at myself one day and I was like, oh, like I'm a control freak now, and like I don't know. Like I say with all of the other ones, like I would love to be like this, but how? It's kind of the same way I feel like this. Like, how do I just stop wanting control over all these aspects of my life? How do I stop wanting to control the way other people feel about me?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can give you some things that have helped other people. Mindfulness meditation, breathing exercises, therapy. There is a sense, though, in which if you try too hard to do those things, you'll probably end up failing, right? And so I think what Watts has to say about this is very wise. Since we've been conditioned to think and act in these ways, there comes a point at which you discover or you realize that what you have been doing up to this point has not been working, and you give up. And then things start getting better. I was just talking to my partner the other day about this, and she made something, her phone background, she's had the same phone background for a while, but this thing came across her feed and it really inspired her. And it said, if being hard on yourself had worked, it would have worked by now. Which is interesting, right? So, there comes a point, and this might not be satisfactory for you currently, but there comes a point where the things that you've been doing exhaust you, or you become exhausted by them, and so you just naturally give them up. Because they're no longer serving you. And I know that's not a good answer, but I can say I personally experienced that, for sure. There comes a point where you realize, and it's not even a realization, it's more of like a feeling that this isn't working. And so you just kind of let go of the reins. And then things turn around. It's amazing. But yeah, I would say mindfulness meditation, good exercise. Breathing exercises can be very helpful. I like the Wim Hof method and breath of fire. Exercise is great. It really helps regulate your mood. If you're just sitting around all day, you're going to get sad. You're going to feel bad. I've been doing a lot of that lately. Sitting around. I'm not too sad. But does this strike anybody else as something that they feel is intuitively right, or something that they wish they could follow? Or maybe you have worries, like that if we don't keep some modicum of control, it's going to be chaos and death. What are y'all's intuitions about this? Do you like this better than some of the other philosophies of life we've looked at? Worse? Is it worse?
I think overall I do really like this philosophy, and I would like to apply it to my life, even though I have a long way to go. Like literally just last week I was having a mental breakdown over like all my schoolwork and how hard I can on myself. Because I am like if I don't have a 4.0, I think my life is gonna like burst into flames and I'll die. You know what I mean?
I used to be exactly like you.
And I would love to be like, okay, I'm just letting go, but then I'm not gonna do any of my schoolwork. I'm just not gonna show up to class. Like for my mental health, if I didn't go to class and didn't do my schoolwork, I'd probably be a lot in a better place because the root of like a lot of my stress and bad thoughts are school. But I can't just not do school, and it's just.
What do you want to do? What brings you joy?
A lot of things.
Are y'all forcing yourselves to be in college?
Yeah. I like creating things, creating content, media, art.
Right.
That's kind of why I'm here, so I can get a job that will let me do that.
You see how so many of our anxieties and worries and stressors come from things that we try to force ourselves to do? We're afraid that if we don't force ourselves to do these things, we're not going to be able to live in the future. Right? But is that fear founded on anything, really? I don't know. Yeah, right? You're like, I don't know. Those thoughts come back. You're like, this is what everybody else is doing, right? I'm not going to be successful if I don't. But what if you directed your energies into the things that you love doing, rather than the things that you feel like you have to do? Wouldn't you find more motivation and inspiration, and therefore probably success in those endeavors? Like making art. Like teaching philosophy. It's scary, right? You don't know how it's going to end up until you do it or not do it, right? What else? What else do you think about this? Does anybody have any thoughts? Yeah.
I definitely have similar fears to what they said about like people who should be like there's some things where I feel like you should restrict yourself or like at least like think about it beforehand, but at the same time it's a very like relaxing sort of mindset to have. It's one that like I feel like I've spent a lot of my life like hyper focusing on like controlling the way I present and the way I act, and it's something that like it's an appealing philosophy to me, at least on like an interpersonal level, in terms of like letting yourself just sort of exist without having to worry about how that affects the world around you and how like that affects like what you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And it's something where I feel like we're not expected or allowed to do that without feeling selfish.
Right. Yeah, there are all of these kind of artificial constructions have been built into our minds, right? We're supposed to think a certain way, we're supposed to act a certain way, we're supposed to go to school so we can get our 4-year degree, so we can have a job, so blah, 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 blah. And then we structure our lives around these things that aren't ours, which ends up producing in us unhappiness, right? Stress, worry. Who do you respect more? The person who's doing everything that they're told to do, or the person who's being themselves? Hard to do that though, right? Like you said. It's a process. You know, you're not going to flip a switch and suddenly become an authentic, genuine person all the time. It's a process. But I can say personally that meditating on this philosophy and trying to organize my life in a way that follows it has brought me a lot of peace and security, personally. I used to be so worried about my grades. I used to be so worried about life and my education, and I would take things so seriously all the time. But you can't control everything. In fact, there's very little things probably that you can control. You don't control the thoughts that pop out of nowhere into your head, right? You don't control the feelings that well up. You don't control the way you feel about a certain person, right? Now, you can exercise control over these things in various ways, but becoming at peace with the way that things are, I think, is a very freeing way of living. Because once you've given up control in that way, once you've given up caring, that stuff no longer affects you. Then you're just doing what you're doing. And it feels good to be doing what you're doing and not operating according to ways of thinking and being that have been installed or programmed into you. We have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Clarifications? It's a very different way of thinking, right? It's not based in this Western mindset that we've been raised in, right? It's kind of a little mystical in a sense. Okay.
How is it pronounced? Is it like a D?
Taoism.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like saying
Yep.
Taoism.
Yeah. Yep. Taoism. Yeah.
This is like just personal, but whatever. Like when I was in 6th grade, that's when we had like our like world religion class in my school, and we learned about all these like Eastern religions, and this one really stuck with me, and I loved Taoism. And at the time, I was going to CCD because my parents raised me Catholic, and I was kind of like, I don't know about you guys, but like I'm converting to Taoism. Like this is kind of my thing now. I don't really know what this whole like Catholic thing is anymore. And like I don't know, I really admire my, I think 11-year-old or 12-year-old self, because I was a lot more like free flowing, and part of that is because I had less responsibility. Like I didn't have all these money issues that I have now, and I don't know, there weren't as many like interpersonal relations in my life. But I don't know, if I could just get back to like my 6th grade mindset, I feel like I'd be a lot better off. That was a long time ago now. I just don't know how to do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we've experienced this certain education and conditioning, that you have to go through as a kid. That puts a particular frame of mind and a particular way of being, programs it into you. It's difficult to uninstall that, right? But perhaps trying to uninstall it is the wrong strategy. At least that's what the Taoists would say. If you're trying to uninstall it, you're just going to bring misery upon yourself. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? Concerns? Comments? All right, I'll let you go then. We're going to have a discussion day on Wednesday to talk about this philosophy of life and other philosophies of life, so come with your questions, all right? Like always, we'll do specific questions first and then general ones.
Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.
Wait, was that the end of this unit already?
No.